The wind clawed at her like a living thing, tearing through the threadbare fabric of her coat and sinking its teeth into the tender skin beneath. Snow whipped around her in furious spirals, blinding her to the world beyond a few feet. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, each step a battle against the numbing cold that had long since claimed her feet. In her arms, the twins huddled close, their small bodies shaking with silent sobs, now too weak even to cry out. She had walked for what felt like hours, perhaps days, though time had blurred into an endless white haze since the wagon had left her behind on the outskirts of the settlement. Her name was Clara, though names meant little in such desolation. The twins, a boy and a girl barely old enough to toddle, pressed against her chest, seeking warmth that was no longer there. She whispered fragments of lullabies into their wool caps, the words stolen by the gale before they could reach her own ears. Once she had believed in promises and the man who had sworn to build a life for them in the new territories. But he was gone now, taken by fever in a dusty mining camp far to the south, leaving her with nothing but these two precious burdens and a heart heavy with the kind of betrayal that no letter or explanation could mend. The journey west had stripped away everything else, layer by layer, like the wind peeling bark from a winter tree. Memories flooded her as she stumbled forward, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. She saw the small cabin they had shared back east, the way his hand had rested on her swelling belly with such tenderness, the laughter that filled the rooms when the twins first kicked inside her. He had spoken of gold and open land, of a future where their children would never know hunger. But the mountains had devoured those dreams just as they now threatened to devour her. She thought of the day the fever took him, how she had held his hand until it went cold, then gathered the twins and what little remained only to find the wagon master unwilling to carry a widow with no coin to her name. They had dumped her here at the edge of the world with a single blanket and a warning about the coming storm. Her knees buckled suddenly and she fell to the frozen ground, the impact jarring her bones. The twins whimpered and she clutched them tighter, her breath coming in ragged gasps that froze in the air before her face. The world spun indifferent, the mountains looming like silent judges in the distance, their peaks lost in the white fury. She thought of giving up, of lying there until the snow covered them all, a quiet end to the suffering. Her fingers, blue and stiff, brushed the boy's cheek, then the girl's, tracing the fragile lines of life that still clung to them. A spark of something, love perhaps, or the raw, stubborn will that had carried her this far kept her from surrendering completely. She tried to rise, but the cold had won its battle with her legs. Then, through the howl of the wind, came a sound. Hooves crunching through the drifts, steady and real. She lifted her head, squinting against the gale. A figure emerged from the white, tall and broad, wrapped in furs and leathers that seemed part of the wilderness itself. His horse, a sturdy chestnut, cut through the storm like a shadow-given form. The mountain man. She had heard tales of such men in the fleeting conversations of travelers, loners, who carved lives from the high places where others dared not go, men who spoke little and saw much. He reined in his mount a few paces away, his eyes sharp and steady under the brim of a weathered hat, taking in her plight with a single glance that missed nothing. The twins stirred against her, and for a moment she feared he would ride on as so many had before. But without a word he dismounted his boots, sinking deep into the snow. He moved with purpose, immediate action, born not of pity, but of something deeper, something carved into him by years of facing the same indifferent world. He knelt beside her, his gloved hands gentle as he lifted the twins, first wrapping them in a thick wool blanket pulled from his saddlebag. Their small cries quieted against the warmth of the fabric. "You ain't dying out here," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly like the rumble of distant thunder rolling off the peaks. He gathered her next, one arm sliding beneath her knees, the other supporting her back as if she weighed no more than a fallen branch. She felt the heat of him through his coat, solid and alive, and for the first time in days, the wind seemed a little less cruel. He settled her on the horse in front of him. The twins cradled between them, then swung up behind his body, shielding hers from the worst of the gale. The ride blurred into motion and warmth, the horse's steady gait carrying them deeper into the folds of the mountains. Clara leaned against him, too spent to question her cheek resting against the rough fur of his collar. The scent of wood smoke and pine clung to him, grounding her in a way the frozen road never had. She did not know his name, only that in the moment of her collapse, the wilderness had sent someone who refused to look away. Your next Wild West story starts here on Wild West Chronicles. The cabin appeared like a memory made solid against the white expanse, low and sturdy, built of hand-hewn logs that had darkened with years of smoke and weather. A thin thread of gray rose from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in the storm. The mountain man carried her inside without pause, ducking beneath the low lintel, his broad shoulders brushing the doorframe. Warmth struck her face like a hand would smoke coffee, the faint animal musk of tanned hides. He set her down on a bench near the hearth, the twins still bundled against his chest, then knelt to feed fresh splits to the fire. Flames leaped up hungry, casting long shadows across the rough plank floor. He worked in silence at first, movements economical and sure. A tin cup of something hot was pressed into her hands, coffee laced with a drop of something stronger, maybe whiskey. She sipped the burn traveling down her throat and waking parts of her that had gone numb. The twins, now unwrapped, lay on a thick bare skin near the fire, their small chests rising and falling in the sudden safety of heat. Color crept back into their cheeks. She watched them, afraid to believe they were still breathing. His name was Elias Crow. He told her that much when he finally spoke, after he had boiled water and cleaned the frostbite from her fingers with careful strokes of a warm cloth. He was 41 winters old, he said, though the lines around his eyes spoke of more. He had come to these mountains after the war, after losing a wife and a son to cholera on a wagon road, much like the one that had abandoned her. The words came out plain, without self-pity, the way a man might describe the lay of a trail or the habits of game. Yet she heard the weight beneath them, the same hollow echo she carried in her own chest. Days blurred into one another. The storm held for 3 more sunrises, sealing them inside the small world of the cabin. Elias taught her the rhythm of survival here, how to bank the fire so it would last the night, how to split kindling with an axe that felt too heavy in her hands at first, how to read the wind's voice through the chinks in the logs. She learned slowly, her body still weak, but she refused to sit idle. When he went out to check his trapline, she swept the floor with a broom made of bundled pine needles, scrubbed the tin plates until they gleamed, rocked the twins when their cries rose sharp against the quiet. He watched her without comment, though once, when she managed to knead dough for the first time without the flour turning to paste, he gave a single nod. It felt like praise. At night, he slept on the floor, giving her the narrow bunk, though she protested at first. He only shook his head. You got young ones. They need you whole. His voice was soft, then almost tender, and she felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall she had built around her heart since the day the fever took her husband. One evening, after the storm finally broke and a thin sun appeared above the ridge, Elias sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle with slow, deliberate strokes. The twins were asleep, bundled together like pups. Clara sat across from him, mending a tear in one of his shirts by the light of the lamp. The needle moved in and out, steadying her hands. You ever think of going back east? She asked the question, slipping out before she could catch it. He paused, the cloth still in his hand. Thought about it once. Long time ago. But the mountains got hold of me. Ain't much left back there worth returning to. She nodded, understanding more than she could say. I don't know where else to go. He looked at her, then really looked, his gray eyes steady. You're here now. That's enough for today. The words settled over her like a blanket. Not a promise, not a claim, just truth spoken plainly. She felt the first faint stirrings of something she had thought dead, the possibility of belonging somewhere again. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world lay quiet and bright under a sky the color of new steel. Elias rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped out to check the woodpile. Clara followed a moment later, the twins cradled in a sling against her chest. The cold bit at her cheeks, but it no longer felt like an enemy. She stood beside him as he stacked split logs, their breaths mingling in white plumes. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same piece of wood, neither pulled away. The days lengthened toward spring, the snow retreating in slow surrender to patches of bare earth and the first stubborn green shoots pushing through. Clara felt the change in her own body, first strength returning to her arms, color to her face, a steadiness in her step that had been absent since the fever took her husband. She no longer flinched at the sound of the axe-splitting wood or the crack of Elias's rifle in the distance. She learned to skin a rabbit without looking away, to read the tracks of deer in the softening mud, to listen for the low groan of ice breaking on the creek below the cabin. Each small mastery felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she had buried under grief. Elias watched her progress without comment most days, though she caught the way his gaze lingered when she carried water from the spring, the twins toddling behind her in mismatched boots he had cut down from his own. One afternoon he came in from checking snares with a small bundle of fox pelts slung over his shoulder. He spread them on the table and began scraping them with a dull blade, the rhythmic scrape filling the quiet room. Clara sat opposite, nursing the girl, while the boy played with a wooden horse Elias had whittled from a fallen pine branch. "You ever think about what you'll do when the thaw comes full?" she asked, keeping her voice light. He kept his eyes on the pelt, same as always. Trap. Hunt. Trade down in the valley when the pass opens. Ain't much changed. But it could, she said softly. His hand stilled. He looked up, then gray eyes searching hers. "You asking if there's room here for 3 more?" She felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the raw honesty of the question. "I'm asking if you want there to be." He set the blade down. "I built this place thinking one man was enough. Learned the hard way it ain't. But wanting and doing, they ain't the same thing." She nodded, understanding the caution carved into him. "I've lost one home already. I won't beg for another." That night, the twins slept soundly in the bunk, and Elias did not take his place on the floor. He sat beside her on the edge of the narrow bed, the firelight painting their faces in shifting gold. They spoke little, but their hands found each other in the dark fingers, threading together, calluses meeting calluses, the simple press of skin against skin saying more than words could hold. When she leaned into him, he did not pull away. His arm came around her shoulders, heavy and sure, and she rested her head against the steady beat of his heart. Weeks passed. The creek swelled with meltwater roaring day and night. Elias showed her how to set beaver traps along the banks, how to read the water's mood, so she could cross without being swept under. She fell once, the current yanking at her skirts, cold shock stealing her breath. His hand caught her wrist before the water could claim her, pulling her back to the bank with strength that felt almost angry in its protectiveness. He did not scold her, only wrapped her in his coat and carried her home, the twins waiting wide-eyed by the door. That evening, as she dried her hair by the fire, he spoke of things he had never shared before. His wife's name had been Mary. Their boy, little Daniel, had been 4 when the cholera came. Elias had buried them side by side under an oak on the edge of a Kansas prairie, then walked west until the land grew too steep for grief to follow. He spoke of it quietly, without flourish, the way a man might describe a long-ago storm. Clara listened, tears slipping down her cheeks, not for his loss alone, but for the way it mirrored her own. When he finished, she reached for his hand again, and this time he held on. Trust grew slowly, like moss on stone. She began to leave small things for him, a tin cup of coffee waiting when he came in from the cold, a shirt mended with careful stitches, the scent of dried sage she hung above the door because he had once said it reminded him of summer. He responded in his own way, a necklace of polished river stones for the twins, a second bunk built against the wall so the children would have their own space, a quiet promise made without words that he would not leave them to the mercy of the road again. One morning in early May, with the sun warm on the new grass, Elias rode out alone to the trading post in the valley. He returned after dusk with a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay 2 plain gold bands, simple and worn from other hands, but cleaned until they caught the lamplight. He held one out to her. "I ain't much for churches or preachers," he said, voice rough, "but I know what a vow means. If you'll have me, Clara, I'll stand by you and these young ones till the mountains wear down." She took the ring, slipped it onto her finger, then placed the other in his palm. Her hand trembled only a little. "I will," she whispered. They stood outside under a sky turning the color of bruised plums, the twins asleep inside the world, quiet except for the soft rush of the creek and the wind moving through new leaves. Elias drew her close, his lips brushing her forehead, then her mouth gentle at first, then deeper, the kind of kiss that carried years of waiting and wanting. When they parted, neither spoke. They did not need to. The first real test came with the spring trading season. Word traveled fast in the high country, carried on the lips of trappers and freighters who passed through the valley below. A man named Harlan Voss had taken up residence in the settlement at the foot of the pass, a former claim jumper with a reputation for buying low and selling high and for collecting debts with interest measured in blood. He had heard of Elias Crow, the solitary mountain man, who now kept a woman and two small children in a cabin that had once belonged to no one but the wind. Voss sent a rider up with a message wrapped around a bottle of cheap whiskey, a demand for half of Elias's spring catch, in pelts for the privilege of wintering on land that rightfully belongs to the company he represents. The company was a fiction. Voss represented only himself and the greed that had driven him west. Elias read the note by lamplight face, unreadable, then fed it to the fire without a word. Clara watched the paper curl and blacken. She had learned enough of him by now to know silence was not indifference. "You going down there?" she asked, keeping her voice even while she rocked the girl in her arms. "Reckon I have to." She felt the old fear rise sharp as a blade against her ribs. "He'll have men." "He will." Elias looked at her, then gray eyes steady. "But I ain't leaving what's mine to be taken." The next morning, he saddled the chestnut and packed light rifle knife, a bedroll, and the two plain gold bands still warm from their fingers the night before. Clara stood in the doorway, the twins clinging to her skirts, watching him check the cinch one last time. She stepped forward, placed her hand flat against his chest over the rough wool of his coat. "If you don't come back," she said, "I'll take the children and walk out of these mountains myself. I won't wait to be abandoned again." He covered her hand with his own. "Then I'll come back." He rode down the trail as the sun cleared the ridge, leaving her with the sound of hooves fading into birdsong and the rush of the creek. The day stretched long and empty. She kept busy chopping kindling until her palms blistered, scrubbing the floor, until the planks shone singing to the twins, until her throat ached, but every small sound from the trees made her heart lurch. She imagined Voss's men surrounding Elias on the narrow path, imagined the crack of gunfire echoing off the rocks, imagined the silence that would follow. Dusk came slow, painting the peaks in blood and gold. She stood outside with a lantern, the flame trembling in the evening breeze, scanning the trail until her eyes burned. The twins had fallen asleep inside, curled together on the bearskin. She refused to go in. Then she heard it, the steady plod of a horse, one horse coming up the switchback. Relief flooded her so fast it nearly dropped her to her knees. Elias appeared out of the twilight coat, torn at the shoulder, a fresh cut above his eyebrow already scabbing over. Blood stained his sleeve, but he sat straight in the saddle. Behind him, tied to the horn, were 3 heavy packs of pelts, his entire spring catch untouched. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left side. Clara crossed the yard in 3 strides, hands reaching for him before she could think. He caught her wrists gently, then pulled her against him. She felt the tremor in his arms, the heat of him, the solid proof that he had kept his word. "Voss," she whispered against his coat, "won't trouble us again." His voice was rough, tired. He had 4 men, 2 left with broken noses and a new respect for mountain hospitality. The other 2, they chose poorly. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. Some things were better carried alone. They stood there a long minute, the lantern guttering between them, the night settling soft around the cabin. Elias reached into his pocket and drew out the small bottle of whiskey Voss had sent, the same one that had carried the threat. He uncorked it, poured a measure into the dirt at their feet. "To debts paid," he said quietly. Clara took the bottle from him, tipped it once more, letting the last drops fall. "To what's ours?" Inside, they tended his wounds by firelight. She cleaned the cut with warm water and whiskey, her fingers steady now where they had once shaken. He watched her face as she worked the lines of worry smoothed away by something deeper. When she finished, he caught her hand, turned it palm up, and pressed his lips to the center of it, a gesture so simple, so unguarded, that tears rose in her eyes. They lay together that night in the narrow bunk, the twins breathing softly in their own small bed across the room. Elias's arm lay heavy across her waist, his breath warm against her neck. Neither spoke of the future in grand terms, but the promise was there. In the quiet they would build it together, season by season, choice by choice. Outside, the creek sang its endless song, and the mountains stood watch, ancient and patient. For the first time in years, Clara slept without dreaming of being left behind. Summer settled over the mountains like a warm hand, turning the aspens gold at the edges and drawing wildflowers up through the thinning snowmelt. The cabin no longer felt like shelter against the world. It had become the center of one. Clara woke each morning to the sound of Elias splitting wood. Outside, the steady thok-thok of the axe, a heartbeat she could feel even through the logs. The twins, now sturdy on their legs and fearless in ways only small children can be, followed him like shadows, gathering kindling in their chubby arms or chasing grasshoppers through the meadow behind the house. Their laughter rang sharp and bright against the quiet peaks, a sound Clara had once believed she would never hear again. She worked beside Elias now without hesitation. Together, they repaired the roof where winter winds had pried shingles loose, their hands moving in unspoken rhythm as they passed nails and held beams steady. She learned to shoot the rifle with enough accuracy to bring down a grouse at 30 paces, though she still preferred the snare line because it felt cleaner, less final. Elias never praised her progress outright, but he began leaving the smaller tasks to her, when he rode out for days at a time, checking distant traps, scouting new beaver ponds, trading pelts at the valley post. Each time he returned, he brought something small, a sack of flour milled finer than before, a length of blue calico for curtains she had once mentioned in passing, a carved wooden spoon for the twins to fight over at supper. One late August evening, with the sky gone, the color of ripe peaches, Elias came in from the creek carrying a string of trout still glistening. Claire had the fire low, the cabin smelling of sage and rising bread. The twins were sprawled in the bearskin, drawing shapes in the ashes with sticks. Elias set the fish down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stood looking at the three of them as though seeing them for the first time. "Reckon we ought to make this official down in the settlement," he said. His voice was quiet, almost careful. "Preacher comes through next month. Folks expect a proper wedding when a man takes a family." Clara paused, knife hovering over the bread she had just sliced. She looked at the rings on their fingers, plain gold worn smooth by months of work, and then at his face. "You think we need a preacher to make it real?" "I think the world does," he answered. "And I think you deserve more than a vow set under the stars." She set the knife down, crossed to him, laid her palm against the side of his face, feeling the rough scrape of his beard, the warmth beneath. "I already have more than I ever thought to ask for." Still, they went. On a crisp September morning, they rode down the trail together, Elias in his best clean shirt, Clara in the blue calico made into a simple dress. The twins perched in front of them on the saddle, wide-eyed at the sight of so many people gathered in one place. The settlement was little more than a cluster of false front buildings and dust. But the preacher, a thin man with a voice like gravel, stood on the steps of the mercantile and waited. They spoke their vows in front of a handful of witnesses, trappers who knew Elias by reputation, a storekeeper's wife who offered wild roses tied with twine, two old miners who removed their hats when Clara walked past. The words were plain familiar from other weddings and other lives. But when Elias took her hands and looked into her eyes, the rest of the world fell away. He promised to stand by her in lean winters and fat summers in sickness, and in the long, quiet nights when grief returned uninvited. She promised the same and more, to keep the fire burning, to teach the children the shape of mercy, to choose him every morning even when the road looked easier another way. When it was done, the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Elias kissed her, not the gentle brush of their first night, but deep and sure in front of God and the mountains and anyone who cared to watch. Someone clapped. Someone else whistled. The twins clapped too, delighted by the noise. They rode home as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the twins asleep against Elias's chest, Clara's head resting on his shoulder. The trail wound upward through stands of pine that smelled of resin and coming frost. At the cabin, they unsaddled the horse in companionable silence, then stood together on the porch, watching the last light bleed out of the sky. Elias reached into his pocket and drew out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. He unfolded it to reveal two tiny silver bells, each no bigger than a thumbnail, threaded on a thin cord. For their first Christmas, he said, nodding toward the sleeping children inside. Figured they ought to have something that rings when they move. Clara took one bell, held it to the fading light. It caught the last rays and threw small stars across the porch boards. She slipped the cord over the boy's wrist, while Elias did the same for the girl. The bells chimed faintly when the twins stirred in their sleep, a soft, secret music. They went inside. Elias banked the fire while Clara tucked the children deeper under the quilts. When she turned, he was waiting by the bunk coat, his shirt open at the throat. She crossed to him without hurry, and he drew her close arms folding around her as though she were the only steady thing left in the world. Outside, the first stars appeared above the peaks, cold and bright. Inside, the cabin held warmth, the scent of bread and wood smoke, the quiet breathing of children who had never known abandonment. Clara rested her forehead against Elias's, felt the slow beat of his heart match her own. They had built something here, not just walls and a roof, but a life stitched together from broken pieces strong enough to hold whatever winters still waited. Winter came again, slower this time, as though the mountains themselves had learned patience. Snow fell in soft, steady drifts, rather than the furious gales of the year before blanketing the cabin in quiet. The creek froze solid enough for the twins to slide on its surface, their laughter sharp and bright against the cold. Clara watched from the porch, wrapped in the heavy buffalo robe Elias had traded for in the valley. Her breath clouding the air while she called warnings they pretended not to hear. Inside, the cabin had changed in small, permanent ways. A second window Elias had cut into the south wall let in pale winter light all morning long. Shelves lined one wall, now holding jars of dried berries, smoked trout, and the precious few books Clara had carried from the East, faded volumes of poetry, and a worn Bible whose pages she still turned when the nights grew long. The twins' drawings, scratched with charcoal on scraps of birch bark, hung above the hearthstick figures of a man with a rifle, a woman with long hair, two small shapes running between them. Family rendered in simple black lines. Elias spent the short days hunting and checking traps, returning with game that kept the larder full. He taught the boy, now called Daniel after the son he had lost, to skin a rabbit without wasting the hide, guiding small hands with his own larger ones until the boy could manage alone. The girl, whom they had named Mary after quiet agreement, one starlit night preferred to stay close to Clara, helping knead dough or sort medicinal herbs gathered in the fall. She had Elias's gray eyes and a stubborn tilt to her chin that made Clara smile even when the child refused to nap. One December afternoon, with the sky low and leaden, Elias rode in earlier than usual. His coat was dusted white, and he carried a small bundle tied behind the saddle. Clara met him at the door, the twins crowding her legs. He lifted the children down first, letting them tug at the mysterious parcel while he unsaddled the horse. When he finally stepped inside, shaking snow from his hat, he set the bundle on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay three small packages wrapped in clean muslin. One for each of them. For Daniel, he said, handing the boy a pocket knife with a bone handle. small enough for young fingers, but sharp enough to matter. The boy's eyes widened. He turned it over and over, testing the weight. For Mary Elias continued giving her a doll carved from cottonwood, its face painted with berry juice, a tiny dress sewn from scraps of calico. She clutched it to her chest and buried her face in Clara's skirts, overcome. For Clara, he saved the last. He placed a small wooden box in her hands. Inside rested a thin silver chain with a single turquoise stone, the color of high country sky in summer. Simple, honest, beautiful. I found the stone years ago, he said quietly. Kept it wrapped in my possibles bag. Never knew what it was waiting for till now. Clara slipped the chain over her head. The stone rested cool against her skin, then warmed quickly. She looked up at him, throat tight. You didn't have to. I wanted to. That night, after the twins were asleep with their new treasures tucked close, Elias and Clara sat by the fire. The wind moaned around the eaves but could not reach them. She leaned against him, head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. They spoke of small things, at first the way Daniel had already nicked his thumb trying the knife, how Mary whispered secrets to her doll, then fell into longer silences filled only with the crackle of burning pine. I used to think this life was punishment, Clara said after a time, being left behind, walking till I couldn't walk anymore. Now I think maybe it was the only way to find us. Elias turned his head, pressed his lips to her temple. I reckon the mountains knew what they were doing when they sent you my way. She lifted her face to his. Their kiss was slow, unhurried, the kind that carried memory and promise in equal measure. When they drew apart, she rested her forehead against his. We're going to have another one, she whispered. He went still. Then his hand moved to her belly, palm flat and gentle, as though afraid to believe it. When spring, I think. Late April, maybe May. A slow smile broke across his face, rare and unguarded. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. She felt the tremor in him, not fear, but something deeper, something like gratitude too large for words. They stayed like that a long while, listening to the fire settle and the children breathe in sleep. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in white silence. Inside, the cabin held light and warmth and the steady pulse of lives woven together against all odds. In the spring, a new child would come, another small life to carry forward. The cabin would grow louder, the days fuller. But tonight was enough. Tonight they had each other, the twins dreaming nearby, the fire burning low, and the mountains standing watch over a future no longer borrowed but truly their own. Don't miss the next Wild West story. Subscribe to Wild West Chronicles.